They humiliated him daily. Every morning at 7:15 a.m., when Isaiah Bennett walked to the glass doors of Apex Financial Corporation, the ritual began. The snickers in the lobby, the dismissive glances from executives rushing past, the way people would literally step around him as if he were an obstacle rather than a person. For 3 years, Isaiah had endured this treatment while working as a security guard at one of the most prestigious investment firms on Wall Street. What they didn't know, what nobody in that gleaming 40-story tower knew, was that Isaiah owned 42% of the company. He was the largest individual shareholder of Apex Financial Corporation, with voting rights that could remove the entire executive team with a single board resolution. But he'd kept it hidden, deliberately, strategically, because Isaiah had learned something profound about human nature. People reveal their true character when they think you're powerless to hold them accountable. The humiliation wasn't subtle. It was systematic, casual, woven into the fabric of daily operations. CFO Richard Morrison would walk past Isaiah's security desk every morning without acknowledgement, as if Isaiah were furniture. VP of Operations Jennifer Drake openly complained about incompetent security staff in earshot of Isaiah, blaming him for minor inconveniences that had nothing to do with his responsibilities. Junior analysts fresh out of Ivy League schools would speak to him in condescending tones, explaining basic concepts as if he couldn't possibly understand financial terminology. But Isaiah understood everything. He'd built his first company at 23, a fintech startup that revolutionized mobile payment processing for underbanked communities. He'd sold that company for $800 million at 29, then spent the next 5 years quietly investing in overlooked opportunities. When Apex Financial had faced a liquidity crisis 4 years ago and desperately needed capital infusion, Isaiah had provided it through a network of shell companies and investment vehicles. He'd structured the deal to give him significant ownership while maintaining complete anonymity. The board knew there was a major shareholder who preferred to remain silent. They called him the shadow investor in internal documents. They had no idea he was a security guard they walked past every day. Isaiah's motivation was revenge. Not exactly. It was something deeper, something that had roots in his childhood. Growing up in South Memphis, Isaiah had watched his father work 3 jobs to support their family. His father had been brilliant, capable, full of ideas that could have transformed their community. But he'd never had access to capital, to networks, to the opportunities that wealthy people took for granted. Isaiah's father had died at 52, exhausted and unfulfilled, his potential buried beneath the weight of systemic barriers. When Isaiah had made his fortune, he'd promised himself 2 things. First, he would invest in people and communities that the financial system overlooked. Second, he would understand the character of the people controlling capital before he ever revealed his power. He needed to know who could be trusted with influence and who would abuse at the moment they thought nobody was watching. So he'd taken the security guard position. He'd submitted a resume under his full legal name, Isaiah Marcus Bennett, knowing that nobody at Apex would connect the dots. The background check had been routine. His references were legitimate. Former colleagues from his security training who didn't know about his wealth. And for 3 years, he'd watched, observed, documented, tested. The tests had been subtle but revealing. There was the incident 6 months ago when Isaiah had accidentally left a folder containing sensitive financial documents near the copy machine. Marcus Chun, a mid-level analyst, had found it and immediately returned it to compliance, reporting the security breach through proper channels. Isaiah had noted his integrity. But Sarah Williams, a senior trader, had photographed the documents with her phone before returning them, clearly planning to use the information for a personal trading advantage. Isaiah had documented everything. There was a morning when Isaiah had overheard CFO Richard Morrison discussing a planned layoff of 200 employees, mostly administrative staff and lower-level analysts, to boost quarterly earnings and secure his own performance bonus. Richard had laughed while describing how he'd framed the layoffs as organizational optimization rather than profit extraction. Isaiah had recorded the conversation. There was the executive meeting where VP Jennifer Drake had proposed cutting the company's diversity recruitment program to streamline hiring costs, arguing that merit-based hiring was more efficient. What she meant And what Isaiah heard clearly was that she wanted to eliminate programs that gave opportunities to people who looked like him. He documented her proposal and the enthusiastic support received from 3 other executives. But there were moments of humanity, too. There was Keisha, the receptionist who always greeted Isaiah by name, who asked about his weekend, who treated him like a person rather than a position. There was David Park, the junior compliance officer who'd stood up in a meeting to defend the diversity program, arguing that excluding talented people based on background was both unethical and economically stupid. There was Maria Santos, the cleaning supervisor who'd invited Isaiah to her daughter's quinceanera, including him in her family celebration without any expectation of return. These were the people Isaiah was watching for, the ones who demonstrated character regardless of circumstance, the ones who treated people with dignity even when there was no personal benefit to doing so, the ones who understood that humanity mattered more than hierarchy. Now, after 3 years of observation, Isaiah was ready. The tests were complete. The documentation was comprehensive. The moment of revelation was carefully planned. In exactly 48 hours, there would be an emergency board meeting called by the shadow investor, Isaiah himself. The meeting would address significant governance concerns and executive misconduct. The executives currently humiliating him daily had no idea that their jobs, their reputations, and their entire understanding of power dynamics were about to be shattered. But first, there was one final test. This morning, CFO Richard Morrison had accidentally spilled coffee on Isaiah's uniform while rushing through the lobby. He hadn't apologized. He'd barely slowed down. Isaiah had simply nodded, changed into a spare uniform, and added the incident to his documentation. Casual cruelty, thoughtless disrespect, the kind of behavior that reveals character more clearly than any formal evaluation ever could. Isaiah returned to his security desk and pulled up the surveillance footage. Every interaction, every conversation, every moment of humiliation, it was all recorded, time-stamped, cataloged, not for revenge, but for accountability. Not to destroy people, but to reveal truth. If you're drawn to stories about hidden power and the moment when truth forces everyone to confront who they really are, make sure you're subscribed. Because in 48 hours, the security guard they've been humiliating daily will walk into that boardroom as the largest shareholder. And every comfortable assumption about power, worth, and character will be dismantled piece by piece. Isaiah's journey to invisibility had begun with visibility. Painful, overwhelming visibility. 7 years ago, when he'd sold his fintech startup for $800 million, the media had celebrated him as a young black tech genius and an inspiration to underprivileged communities. The coverage had been well-intentioned but reductive, focusing more on his background than his innovation, more on his race than his technical brilliance. The attention had brought opportunity, but it had also brought something darker. The revelation of who people became when they thought proximity to wealth could benefit them. Childhood friends he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reached out with business proposals. Distant relatives appeared with requests for loans. Investors who rejected his initial pitch suddenly wanted meetings to explore future partnerships. The moment that changed everything had been simple. Isaiah had attended a charity gala, his first major social event as a newly wealthy entrepreneur. A prominent venture capitalist named Gerald Whitmore had approached him, champagne in hand, with what he clearly thought was a compliment. Isaiah, I have to say, you're so articulate. It's really impressive how you've overcome your circumstances. The words had landed like a slap. Overcome his circumstances. As if his brilliance was surprising. As if his success was an exception rather than the result of capability. Gerald had meant it as praise, but Isaiah had heard the underlying assumption. People from his background weren't supposed to be here. That night, Isaiah had made a decision. He would disappear from public view. He would invest his wealth strategically, but anonymously. And most importantly, he would understand the character of the people controlling capital before he ever revealed himself again. He needed to know who would treat him with dignity regardless of his perceived status, and who would only respect him when he'd offer them something. The security guard position at Apex Financial had been strategic. Apex was one of the most influential investment firms on Wall Street, managing pension funds, directing billions in capital, influencing economic policy. If Isaiah wanted to understand how the financial system truly operated, not the public-facing mission statements, but the actual decision-making behind closed doors, he needed to be invisible inside it. His first day had been revelatory. The orientation had included a session on company culture that emphasized respect, collaboration, and merit-based advancement. Within 3 hours of starting his shift, Isaiah had watched a senior executive berate a junior analyst for a minor mistake, using language that was professionally abusive. The executive had done it openly, in the lobby, because he assumed the only witness was a security guard who didn't matter. Isaiah had documented it, not just the incident, but the pattern it represented. Test 1 had involved Richard Morse, the CFO. Richard had a reputation as a financial genius, someone who could navigate complex markets and deliver consistent returns. But Isaiah had observed something darker during his 3 years of invisible observation. Richard operated through a philosophy of extraction rather than creation. He didn't build value. He identified existing value and captured it for shareholders regardless of the human cost. 6 months into Isaiah's tenure, there had been a strategic decision about a portfolio company, a manufacturing firm employing 1,500 people in the Midwest. The company was profitable but facing temporary challenges due to supply chain disruptions. Richard's recommendation had been clear. Leverage the disruption to force concessions from workers, cut wages and benefits, and if the workers resisted, liquidate the company and sell the assets. Isaiah had listened to the executive discussion from his position near the conference room. What struck him wasn't just a decision, brutal but common in finance, but Richard's language. He called the workers legacy liabilities and described their resistance to pay cuts as irrational unwillingness to accept market realities. Richard didn't see people. He saw obstacles to profit maximization. Isaiah had documented the meeting, but he'd also done something else. He'd used his anonymous shareholder power to block the liquidation, forcing the board to support the company through the supply chain challenges instead. The workers kept their jobs. The company recovered. And Richard never knew that the security guard he walked past daily had overruled him. Test 2 involved Jennifer Drake, VP of Operations. Jennifer presented herself as progressive, often speaking about inclusive leadership and diverse perspectives in public settings. But Isaiah had watched her actual decisions, and they told a different story. When a talented black analyst named Marcus Chun had proposed an innovative restructuring strategy that could save the company millions, Jennifer had dismissed it in the executive meeting. Not because the strategy was flawed. Isaiah had reviewed it thoroughly and recognized its brilliance, but because she'd already decided to implement a similar plan from a white Ivy League consultant she'd hired at triple Marcus's salary. The consultant's plan was nearly identical to Marcus's proposal, but Jennifer presented it as a sophisticated external insight rather than acknowledging Marcus's contribution. Isaiah had documented the pattern. Marcus was the third person of color in 18 months whose ideas had been appropriated without credit. Jennifer's inclusive leadership with performative rhetoric that masked systematic exclusion. Test 3 was more subtle. It involved Sarah Williams, a senior trader who'd built her reputation on aggressive risk-taking and high returns. Sarah was brilliant at reading markets, but Isaiah had discovered something troubling. She was also brilliant at manipulating information. The incident with the confidential documents Isaiah had accidentally left near the copy machine had been deliberate. He'd wanted to see what Sarah would do with information she wasn't supposed to have. She'd photographed the documents, details about an upcoming merger that would significantly impact stock prices, and used them for personal trades through an offshore account she thought was untraceable. Isaiah had traced it. He'd documented the trades, the timeline, the clear pattern of insider trading. Sarah's success wasn't just skill. It was systemic cheating masked by her reputation for market insight. Test 4 involved people on the margins. Keisha, the receptionist, earned $42,000 annually while working for a company that generated billions in revenue. She had 2 children, student loan debt, and dreams of finishing her MBA. When Isaiah had asked her about her goals, she'd been candid. "I know I'm capable of more, but nobody here sees receptionists as having potential. We're invisible." Isaiah had watched how Keisha treated people. She was kind to everyone, executives, analysts, cleaning staff, security guards. Her humanity wasn't conditional on someone's title or usefulness. It was simply who she was. Over 3 years, Isaiah had quietly funded her MBA through an anonymous scholarship program he created. Keisha had no idea where the funding came from, but she'd been accepted to a top program and was thriving. Test 5 involved David Park, the compliance officer who defended the diversity recruitment program. David was 28, relatively junior, and he'd risked his career by contradicting Jennifer Drake in an executive meeting. When Jennifer had proposed cutting diversity initiatives, David had stood up and presented data showing that diverse teams outperformed homogeneous ones by every measurable metric. Jennifer had been furious. She tried to discredit David's research, questioned his methodology, suggested his analysis was politically motivated rather than data-driven. But David had held his ground, calmly presenting evidence until Jennifer had been forced to table the proposal. Isaiah had watched the exchange and seen something rare: moral courage backed by competence. David hadn't just objected on principle, he'd done the work to prove his point. That combination of values and capability was exactly what Isaiah believed leadership should look like. Test 6 was Maria Santos, the night cleaning supervisor. Maria earned slightly above minimum wage despite managing a team of 30 people and maintaining the building's operations. She was in her 50s, a first-generation immigrant from Guatemala, and she treated her work with profound dignity. Isaiah had observed how Maria led her team. She never demanded respect. She earned it through fairness and competence. When one of her team members had a family emergency and needed time off, Maria had covered the shift herself rather than reporting the absence to HR. When a junior executive had been disrespectful to one of Maria's cleaners, Maria had calmly but firmly addressed it, explaining that all workers deserve basic courtesy regardless of their position. Isaiah had documented Maria's leadership. He'd also quietly increased her compensation through an anonymous donation to the company's employee hardship fund that specifically benefited long-term facility staff. Maria had received a raise and didn't know why, but she'd used the extra income to help her daughter start a small business. The pattern was clear. The people at the top of the hierarchy, Richard, Jennifer, Sarah, demonstrated character defined by extraction, opportunism, and conditional respect. The people at the margins, Keisha, David, Maria, demonstrated character defined by integrity, courage, and unconditional humanity. Now, 48 hours before the emergency board meeting, Isaiah was implementing the final test. He'd sent an anonymous memo to all executives asking for input on improving employee engagement and operational efficiency. The memo included specific questions about compensation equity, diversity initiatives, and worker dignity. Richard's response had been telling: focus on productivity metrics. Engagement is secondary to performance. Jennifer's response: we should benchmark against industry standards rather than creating unnecessary internal programs. Sarah hadn't responded at all, but David had sent a detailed proposal for restructuring compensation to reduce the gap between highest and lowest paid employees. Keisha had suggested a mentorship program connecting entry-level staff with senior leadership. Maria had proposed cross-training initiatives that would give facilities workers opportunities for skill development and career advancement. The responses confirmed everything Isaiah had observed over 3 years. Character reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in how people respond when they think nobody important is watching. The executives who humiliated him daily had failed every test. The workers they dismissed as invisible had passed every one. Tomorrow, Isaiah would submit the final documentation to the board: evidence of Richard's extractive decision-making, Jennifer's systematic exclusion disguised as inclusion, Sarah's insider trading. But he'd also submit something else: recommendations for immediate promotion of David, Keisha, and Maria to senior leadership positions, backed by detailed evidence of their capability, integrity, and leadership potential. The humiliation was about to end, not through revenge, but through revelation. The security guard they dismissed as powerless was about to demonstrate that true power isn't about domination. It's about accountability, justice, and the courage to demand that people's character matches their position. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Thursday. The 12 board members arrived at Apex Financial's executive conference room, a space of glass walls, leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. They'd been told only that the shadow investor had called a meeting to address urgent governance matters, and that attendance was mandatory. Isaiah arrived at 8:45 a.m., still in a security uniform. He stood outside the conference room, watching through the glass as board members settled into their seats, confusion evident on their faces. None of them had ever met the shadow investor. Some had speculated about his identity for years: a foreign sovereign wealth fund, a tech billionaire seeking privacy, an institutional investor avoiding publicity. Nobody had considered that he might be the security guard standing outside their meeting. At exactly 9 a.m., Isaiah walked into the conference room. The board chair, Patricia Morrison, looked up with mild irritation. "I'm sorry, but this is a closed board meeting. We'll need you to—" "My name is Isaiah Marcus Bennett," Isaiah said calmly, taking a seat at the head of the table. "I'm the shadow investor. I own 42% of this company, and I've called this meeting to address systematic misconduct in executive leadership." The silence was absolute. Patricia's mouth opened, but no words emerged. The other board members stared in confusion, then recognition, then something approaching shock as Isaiah pulled out a tablet and began displaying documents on the conference room screen. "For the past 3 years," Isaiah continued, "I've worked as a security guard in this building. I've observed executive decision-making, documented leadership behavior, and tested the character of the people running this company. What I've discovered is a pattern of extraction, discrimination, and casual cruelty that violates both the company's stated values and basic standards of human decency." He clicked to the first document, a recording of CFO Richard Morris discussing the planned layoff of 200 employees to boost his performance bonus. Richard's voice filled the room. "We frame it as organizational optimization. The workers don't need to know it's about executive compensation." Richard, who just walked into the meeting expecting a routine governance discussion, went pale. "That was a private conversation. That was a decision affecting 200 families," Isaiah interrupted. "A decision you made to increase your personal wealth by approximately $3 million while destroying the financial security of people who built this company. I blocked that layoff using my shareholder voting rights, but I documented your intent." He clicked to the next document, surveillance footage of Jennifer Drake's executive meeting, where she dismissed Marcus Chen's restructuring proposal, then presented an identical plan from an expensive consultant weeks later. "VP Jennifer Drake has systematically appropriated ideas from analysts of color," Isaiah said. "Not once, 3 times in 18 months. She's built her reputation on stealing intellectual labor from people she considers beneath her notice. Marcus Chen's proposal alone would have saved this company $12 million. Jennifer paid a consultant $400,000 to present the same plan, while Marcus received no credit and no compensation." Jennifer started to object, but Isaiah continued, displaying a detailed analysis, comparing Marcus's original proposal to consultant's report. The documents were nearly identical. "And then there's Sarah Williams," Isaiah said, clicking to trading records. "Senior trader with an impressive track record. What the board doesn't know is that her success is partly built on systematic insider trading. On March 15th, I deliberately left confidential merger documents near a copy machine. Sarah photographed them and used that information for her personal trades through an offshore account registered under her mother's maiden name. I've documented 6 similar instances over 2 years." Sarah stood up abruptly. "This is entrapment. You can't." "I can present evidence of securities fraud to the SEC," Isaiah said calmly, "which I've already done. Federal investigators will contact you this afternoon." The board members were processing multiple revelations simultaneously. The shadow investor was their security guard. The executives they trusted had systematically violated ethical and legal standards. The person they'd been dismissing daily had been documenting everything. Patricia Morrison found her voice. "Mr. Bennett, if what you're saying is accurate, this represents serious misconduct. But why didn't you come forward through normal channels?" "Because normal channels protect people in power," Isaiah responded. "If I'd reported this as a security guard, I would have been dismissed, likely fired, possibly blacklisted. Power only listens to power. So I waited until I had comprehensive documentation and the leverage to demand accountability." He clicked to a new section of his presentation. But this meeting isn't just about removing corrupt executives. It's about examining the systematic character failures that allowed this corruption to flourish. Every person I'm about to show you has demonstrated integrity, capability, and moral courage while being dismissed as invisible by the people in leadership. The screen displayed David Park's personnel file alongside his proposal for compensation equity. David Park is a junior compliance officer earning $68,000 annually. He stood up to Jennifer Drake in an executive meeting, presenting data that proved diverse teams outperform homogeneous ones. He risked his career to defend an ethical principle. I'm recommending him for immediate promotion to VP of Compliance with a salary of $250,000 and a mandate to restructure our hiring practices. Next came Keisha's file. Keisha Williams is our front desk receptionist earning $42,000 annually while pursuing her MBA at night. She treats every person who walks through our doors with dignity and professionalism, regardless of their title. I've observed her diffuse conflicts, solve problems, and demonstrate leadership that many of our executives lack. I'm recommending her for promotion to Director of Employee Engagement, salary $180,000, with responsibility for rebuilding our company culture. Maria Santos's file appeared next. Maria Santos manages our facilities team, 30 people maintaining this building's operations. She earns $54,000 annually despite demonstrating more effective leadership than most of our executive team. In the emergency, Maria covered the shift herself. When a junior executive was disrespectful to her team, Maria addressed it with firmness and grace. I'm recommending her for promotion to VP of Operations, replacing Jennifer Drake, with a salary of $300,000. The board members were leaning forward now, processing the implications. Isaiah wasn't just removing corrupt executives. He was proposing a fundamental restructuring that elevated people from the margins to positions of power. Here's what's going to happen, Isaiah continued. Richard Morris, Jennifer Drake, and Sarah Williams will resign immediately. They can choose to resign quietly, or I'll release this documentation publicly and pursue legal action. The choice is theirs. Richard started to speak, but Isaiah cut him off. You humiliated me daily for 3 years. You walked past me like I was furniture. You spilled coffee on me this week without apologizing. You thought you could treat people like disposable resources because nobody in power was watching. But someone was watching. I was watching. And now you're facing the consequences of who you chose to be when you thought it didn't matter. Jennifer was trembling with rage and humiliation. This is a witch hunt. You can't just... I can restructure leadership based on demonstrated character and capability, Isaiah said, which is exactly what I'm doing. You can resign with a standard severance package, or I can release documentation showing how you systematically stole credit from analysts of color while claiming to champion diversity. Your choice. Sarah had already stood up and left the room, presumably calling her attorney. The second part of this restructuring, Isaiah continued, involves compensation equity. I've analyzed our salary structure. The gap between our highest and lowest paid employees is currently 38-1. I'm proposing we reduce that to 12-1 over 3 years, funded by reducing executive compensation and increasing wages for entry-level and facility staff. This isn't charity, it's justice. The people at the bottom of our hierarchy create the foundation that allows people at the top to succeed. They deserve compensation that reflects their value. One of the board members, an older man named Thomas Chun, spoke up. Mr. Bennett, I appreciate the moral framework you're presenting, but we have fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders. Reducing executive compensation and raising entry-level wages will impact our profitability. Actually, Isaiah responded, pulling up another document. It will increase profitability. I've modeled this extensively. Higher wages reduce turnover, which reduces recruitment and training costs. Better treatment of employees increases productivity and reduces conflict. Promoting people based on demonstrated character rather than credential creates better leadership. Every metric improves when you invest in your people rather than extracting maximum value from them. He let that sink in, then continued. I'm the largest shareholder. I'm proposing these changes not despite my fiduciary responsibility, but because of it. Short-term extraction destroys long-term value. I'm optimizing for sustainable success rather than quarterly earnings manipulation. Patricia Morrison looked at the other board members, then back at Isaiah. This is unprecedented. We'll need time to review your documentation, verify your claims, and... You have 72 hours, Isaiah said. I've submitted everything to your secure portal. If the board doesn't act within 3 days, I'll call a special shareholder meeting and replace the entire board. I have the voting rights to do that, but I prefer to work collaboratively if you're willing to prioritize accountability over protecting executives who violated their positions. He stood up, gathering his materials. One more thing. For 3 years, I've been humiliated daily by people who thought their titles gave them permission to treat others as less than human. That ends today. Not because I'm seeking revenge, but because I'm demanding a standard where character matters more than credentials, where power comes with accountability, and where the people doing the actual work receive the dignity and compensation they've earned. Isaiah walked to the door, then paused. The security guard you dismissed wasn't powerless. He was simply waiting to see who you'd be when you thought nobody important was watching. You failed that test. Now you're facing the consequences. He left the conference room and returned to his security desk. Within an hour, Richard, Jennifer, and Sarah had all submitted resignation letters. By that afternoon, the board had voted unanimously to accept Isaiah's restructuring proposal. And by the following Monday, David Park, Keisha Williams, and Maria Santos received promotion offers that would change their lives and reshape the company's culture. The humiliation had ended, not through revenge, but through revelation. The invisible man had become impossible to ignore, and everyone who'd thought power insulated them from accountability discovered that true power is the courage to demand justice even when it costs something to pursue it. 6 months after the board meeting, Apex Financial Corporation looked fundamentally different, not in its physical appearance. The glass tower still gleamed, the marble lobby still echoed with footsteps, the conference room still overlooked Manhattan, but the culture, the values, the actual lived experience of working there had transformed completely. David Park's first act as VP of Compliance had been to implement blind resume reviews, eliminating names and schools from initial hiring evaluations. Within 3 months, the diversity of new hires had increased by 40%. But more importantly, the quality of hires had improved across every metric. Turns out that when you evaluate people based on capability rather than pedigree, you discover talent in places the old system had systematically overlooked. Keisha Williams had restructured employee engagement from performative HR function into an actual system of feedback, accountability, and opportunity. She created mentorship programs that connected entry-level staff with senior leadership, not through formal assignments, but through genuine relationships built on mutual respect. The junior analyst who'd previously been invisible to executives was now regularly consulting on strategy because Keisha had created channels for talent to be recognized regardless of where it originated. Maria Santos had transformed operations. She'd implemented cross-training programs that gave facilities workers opportunities to develop new skills, created pathways for advancement that didn't require credentials many couldn't afford, and redesigned workflows to honor the expertise of people who actually did the work rather than managing from a distance. Employee satisfaction had increased by 68%. Turnover had dropped by half, and productivity had risen because people who felt valued performed better than people who felt disposable. But the most profound changes weren't measured in metrics. They were visible in small daily interactions. Executives now greeted security guards by name. Analysts asked cleaning staff about their weekends. The receptionist's insights were sought in strategic meetings because people had learned that intelligence and perspective exist everywhere if you're willing to pay attention. Richard Morris had faced both professional and legal consequences. After resigning from Apex, he'd been unable to find comparable positions elsewhere. Word spreads quickly in finance, and his pattern of extractive decision-making had become known. The federal investigation into his conduct had resulted in fines and a 5-year ban from serving in executive financial roles. But something unexpected had happened during his forced sabbatical. Without the insulation of power and wealth, Richard had been forced to confront who he'd become. He'd started volunteering at a financial literacy nonprofit, teaching underserved communities about money management. The work had been humbling. He was serving people he'd previously dismissed as legacy liabilities. But slowly, working directly with people whose struggles he'd previously abstracted into spreadsheet figures, something shifted in Richard's understanding of what success actually meant. He'd sent Isaiah a letter 6 months after resigning, not asking for anything, just acknowledging the harm he'd caused and the character failures that had enabled it. "I spent 15 years optimizing for profit extraction," Richard had written. "I never stopped to ask what I was destroying in the process. Thank you for forcing me to confront that." Isaiah had responded, "Character can change if we're willing to examine ourselves honestly. I hope you continue this work." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement that people can grow if they choose accountability over defensiveness. Jennifer Drake's journey had been more complicated. She'd initially fought the resignation, hired attorneys, threatened lawsuits. But when Isaiah had privately shown her the comprehensive documentation, not just the appropriation of ideas, but the systematic pattern of exclusion she'd practiced while claiming to champion inclusion, something cracked in her certainty. She'd spent 3 months in what she later described as a personal reckoning. She'd joined a professional coaching program focused on examining unconscious bias and systemic discrimination. She'd reached out to Marcus Chun and the other analysts whose work she'd stolen, apologizing not with excuses, but with genuine acknowledgement of harm caused. Marcus had been skeptical at first, but Jennifer's apology had included something tangible. She'd recommended him for a senior position at another firm, using her connections to create opportunity rather than blocking it. She'd also committed to mentoring young professionals of color, using her experience as a cautionary tale about how easy it is to perpetuate systems you claim to oppose. Isaiah had watched her transformation from a distance. He remained skeptical. Genuine change takes years to prove, but he appreciated that Jennifer had chosen growth over denial. Sarah Williams had faced criminal prosecution for insider trading. The evidence Isaiah had collected was comprehensive and undeniable. She'd ultimately pleaded guilty to securities fraud and received a 3-year sentence plus substantial fines. Her career in finance was over. But during the trial, something unexpected emerged in her testimony. Sarah had described the pressure of being one of few women in a male-dominated industry. The feeling that she had to perform at impossible levels to be taken seriously. The way that pressure had rationalized increasingly unethical shortcuts. It didn't excuse her actions, but it contextualized them. Isaiah had watched the proceedings and felt something complex. Anger at what she'd done, but also recognition of the systems that had shaped her choices. He'd submitted a victim impact statement that was unusual in its balance. Ms. Williams broke the law and must face consequences. But we should also examine the culture that made cheating feel necessary for survival. Accountability for individuals must coexist with accountability for systems. The real transformation at Apex wasn't about punishing bad actors. It was about building systems where good character could thrive. Isaiah had used his majority shareholder power to restructure the entire compensation and advancement framework. No longer would success be measured purely by short-term profit extraction. Instead, performance reviews now evaluated leaders on 3 dimensions equally: financial results, employee development, and ethical decision-making. The shift had been controversial among some board members who worried it would hurt competitiveness. But Isaiah had let the results speak for themselves. After 6 months under the new system, Apex's financial performance had actually improved. Turns out that companies built on sustainable value creation outperformed those built on extractive short-termism. Who knew? More importantly, the company had become a place where people like Keisha, David, and Maria could thrive, where a receptionist could become a director, where a junior compliance officer could reshape hiring practices, where a facilities supervisor could transform operations, where character mattered as much as credentials. Isaiah had eventually stepped into a formal role as chairman of the board, no longer maintaining his security guard position. But he'd kept the uniform, framed in his office as a reminder, not as a trophy of his vindication, but as a symbol of what he'd learned during those 3 years of intentional invisibility. People reveal their true character when they think you're powerless. The plaque beneath the uniform read, "Choose to be someone whose character doesn't change based on who's watching." He'd also created something new, a foundation that provided capital and mentorship to entrepreneurs from overlooked communities. People like his father, brilliant, capable, full of potential, but lacking access to the networks and resources that wealth takes for granted. The foundation didn't just provide funding, it provided belief. Because sometimes the most valuable investment isn't money. It's someone powerful choosing to see potential in places the system has trained us to overlook. One year after the board meeting, Isaiah stood in the lobby of Apex Financial where he'd been humiliated daily for 3 years. But now he stood there differently. Not as invisible security, but as chairman hosting a company-wide meeting about the year's transformation. Employees gathered in the atrium. Isaiah looked at the faces. David, now confidently leading compliance with moral clarity. Keisha, whose employee engagement programs had become an industry model. Maria, whose operational innovations had been featured in management journals. And hundreds of others whose daily dignity had been honored rather than dismissed. A year ago, Isaiah began, this company operated on a simple but destructive principle. Some people matter and some don't. Executives mattered. Entry-level staff didn't. Credentialed analysts mattered. Security guards didn't. People who looked and sounded like traditional success mattered. People who didn't were invisible. He paused, letting the history settle. What I learned during 3 years working security is that character exists everywhere. Intelligence exists everywhere. Leadership potential exists everywhere. It's not distributed based on titles or credentials or where you went to school. It's distributed based on choices. How you treat people when you think it doesn't matter, what you do when nobody important is watching, who you choose to be when power gives you permission to be cruel. The executives who humiliated me daily thought they were powerful, but they were actually revealing their weakness, their inability to recognize humanity outside hierarchical structures. Real power isn't domination. Real power is the courage to demand that our actions align with our values, even when it costs something to do so. He looked directly at the employees who'd been promoted from the margins. Keisha, David, Maria, you weren't invisible because you lacked capability. You were invisible because the people in power weren't paying attention. My role wasn't to rescue you. It was to create systems where your capability could be recognized and rewarded. You did the hard work. I just removed the barriers that were blocking you. The applause started small, then grew, but Isaiah raised his hand. Don't applaud me. Hold me accountable. Hold every leader in this company accountable. Demand that power comes with responsibility. Insist that character matters as much as credentials. And remember, the person you dismiss as invisible today might be the person whose character you need tomorrow. Treat everyone with dignity not because of what they can offer you, but because that's who you choose to be. As the meeting concluded and employees returned to work, Isaiah returned to his office. On his desk was a letter from his father's former employer, the factory where his father worked 3 jobs simultaneously, where his brilliance had never been recognized, where he died exhausted and unfulfilled. The factory had read about Isaiah's story. They wanted to create a scholarship fund honoring his father's memory, providing educational opportunities for workers' children. They were asking Isaiah to help design it. He read the letter twice, then began drafting a response. Not just agreeing to help, but proposing something bigger, a national initiative providing capital, education, and mentorship to workers whose potential had been dismissed by systems designed to overlook them. His father's legacy wouldn't be defined by what the system had denied him. It would be defined by the opportunities Isaiah created for others facing similar barriers. That was true power, not domination, but liberation. Not revenge, but transformation. Not humiliation, but restoration of dignity to people who've been invisible too long. Before you go, I want to know, what city are you watching the story from? Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening to this tale of hidden power and revealed character. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to join our community. We share stories about people who were humiliated, dismissed, and treated as invisible until the moment their true power was revealed and everything changed. New episodes drop weekly, and each one is a reminder that the people you overlook today might be the ones who reshape your world tomorrow. Subscribe now, and don't miss a single story of accountability, justice, and the courage to demand that power comes with responsibility.